Today we have Jeffrey Hammond, Principal Analyst from Forrester Research. Thanks for being here, Jeffrey.
My pleasure.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about the landscape of enterprise mobility and the challenges that companies are facing today?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that folks face is the rate of change. It really is stripping an awful lot of gears. Just to put it in context, if you think about laptops and the operating systems that we have on our laptops, I still run into lots of clients that are running Windows XP. It's a 10 years old operating system. Yeah, it's on Service Pack 3, but they're just now starting to roll out Windows 7, which is 6 years old. Now think about how that meets the mobility market, where you've got major operating system upgrades every 8 months to 12 months, and the minute that one of those upgrades comes out, all the users go out and start to download it. IT shops have no control over the operating system anymore, and they're essentially having to give up things at the hardware level, they're having to give up control at the operating system level, and they're having to fall back to the application level. And the security groups, the infrastructure and operations groups, and then lastly, the application development groups all sit there and say, how are we going to get faster? How are we going to retain some semblance of control when essentially the rug has been pulled out from under our feet?
So what are some key trends in the global market?
Okay, well, let's take it at a couple different levels. First of all, from the hardware level. Typically we look at 3 different classes of devices. You look at feature phones, 12-key phones. You look at smartphones, of course, things like the iPod, or I'm sorry, the iPhone and the Android devices, and then the devices in between, quick messaging devices, devices that have the text QWERTY keyboards. What we are seeing is the beginnings of major conversion from feature phones to smartphones. Here in the US, depending on whose stats you look at, we're over 50% of adults that now have smartphone class devices. Things are a little bit slower in some of the other geos, but that conversion to smartphones is a big one. The second thing is a quick messaging device category in the middle. We're starting to see that commoditize out. The biggest reason is because of Android as an open source operating system. You see lots of Chinese manufacturers putting Android on these quick messaging devices and essentially turning them into smartphones, even as smartphones become superphones. So from a technology perspective, from an apps perspective, that essentially is taking us from 2 technology class devices down, or 3 down to 2, and it's making those 2 the majority devices in market and giving app developers an awful lot of opportunities. So even from an enterprise perspective, whether you're reaching out to consumers and you're looking at those devices, or to employees, it's actually simplifying the mobile architecture, which is one of the reasons that we see so many people who are interested in building apps that were never interested in building apps 2 or 3 years ago.
Right. How does that differ from the US over to Europe and beyond?
Yeah, I think the differences are more statements of points in time than they are real user behavior, at least when it comes to the US and Europe. So in Europe, we do see a lag in smartphone adoption, and actually there's quite a bit of variance from north to south. If you look at the UK and the Nordics, you see smartphone adoption rates which are pretty close to parity with the US, but as you get into Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, Spain, you see those smartphone rates start to drop. But if you look at the data from a historic perspective, those rates and the growth look very similar to what we were seeing in the US maybe 18 months ago. So I think, if you project out maybe 18 months to 2 years, you'll see many of the European countries going over 50% in terms of smartphone adoption as well. In Asia, we see a real difference between metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas. So if you look, for example, in metropolitan China, metropolitan India, the smartphone adoption rates are very high. They look very much like the US, sometimes as much as 50% or more. Once you get outside the cities, usage drops off dramatically, and there we don't see as much of a conversion to the higher classes of hardware or to application-capable, full web browser-capable devices. Africa still dominated largely by feature phones.